Hey, what's up guys? I'm Dave Klein, and welcome to a new series of mine, a breakdown retrospective of various games. As people know me for the Souls series, I thought this would be a good place to start, but I do intend to cover more games outside of Souls, as game design is a passion of mine. Also, I'd love to know your thoughts on this type of video when it wraps, as I'm new to this. So, that said, here's a critical analysis of Dark Souls, both its pros and cons, what makes the game work, and perhaps what could have been improved. There will be spoilers, as I'd like to talk about the overall game in depth, so you have been warned. Dark Souls starts the game simple enough with a character creator, which I think for repeat playthroughs and experienced players is a great place to start, but can be kind of intimidating for someone new to a franchise. While players returning from Demon Souls will know what kind of character they want to play, being immediately thrown a number of stats without ever having played a game is a rough place to start. To be honest, on my first playthrough, I pulled up a guide as I already felt like I could be screwing up at this point. I've never been a huge fan of presenting new players immediately with stat choices to choose before they've even had a chance to play the game for this reason. If you've never played a game before, you don't know what build you're going to like, you don't know what works and doesn't work for that particular game, and it's a lot to handle right from the get-go before you have any investment in the game at hand. I'm definitely a fan of RPGs and love the ability to customize your stats, but my main point is this can be intimidating, especially for a game that has the reputation of Dark Souls, whether deserved or not, of being challenging. One possible solution is to have a tutorial portion of the game where the player at least learns basic mechanics before they get to choose their stats, and in this case, that would happen when the player arrives at Firelink Shrine. However, that's really just a different choice as it creates its own problems. The character creator at that point would pull you out of the game and possibly ruin your sense of immersion, as you should already have an idea of who your character is if you're doing role-playing. I don't think there's necessarily a solution to this problem, but do want to point out my own frustrations with it, as I'm sure I'm not the only one who struggles with this. From here we get what I think is one of Dark Souls' strongest aspects over Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, and Bloodborne, and even to an extent Dark Souls 3, which is its intro cinematic. There's a strong pull to take cinematics completely out of video games, as they take you out of the game, and at that point you're watching something happen as opposed to playing. But I think they can have their place, and this is the perfect example of that. In the intro cinematic, we find out about the creation of the world and are given a little backstory to the overall game, which will become essential to its story. But the main point I want to focus on here is what the cinematic highlights. We're shown horrifying looking ancient dragons, and then 4 amazingly powerful lords fighting off these ancient dragons and starting the entire world as we'll come to know it. Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, Nito, and Seath. The cinematic makes them look incredibly powerful, and they absolutely stand out as they're shown fighting off the ancient dragons. What this creates is an automatic understanding of who some of the major bosses you'll end up fighting are. You don't know it yet, but as you progress further into the game and realize you're about to have to fight Nito, or Seath, or the Witch of Izalith, or finally Gwyn, living legends who we witness creating the world and destroying the ancient dragons, the tone is set for you. These are characters we know, we might revere or fear, and know are insanely powerful. They created the world you stand on, and you're about to have to go fight them, and that's both intimidating and exciting. In Demon Souls, we're told the overall lore of the world and given some minor backstory about warriors who've disappeared, which works just fine, but it doesn't have the same effect. In Dark Souls 2, we get some cutscene about some weird world under the water, which, despite all of my lore videos on the game, I still don't really understand. It doesn't do anything for you other than make the world seem mystical and strange. Bloodborne sets the tone of you being in a creepy world where you seem to have just screwed yourself, but not much beyond that. And finally, Dark Souls 3 replicates what Dark Souls 1 did, giving us beings that we're going to have to fight and names that we'll know. But it's not as effective, as these are simply beings who became lords and had sacrificed themselves to extend the Age of Fire at some point in time. That's not nearly as important or wild as the beings who created the entire world and mythology you exist within. And I know I'm harping on this intro for a while, but I think it's just that good and that well worth praising. Finally, with the intro cinematic out of the way, we find ourselves in prison, and a character helps break us out, Oscar of Astora. It's worth mentioning this, as it's something I've heard other creators talk about before in mentioning what makes you like an NPC. We immediately like Oscar, and he's more important to us than most NPCs in other games, simply by the virtue of it's he who gives us the key that gets us out of prison. Characters who help you or do things for you are the ones who you'll tend to end up liking. If characters get in your way, such as Lautrec, we end up hating them, regardless of how virtuous they may end up being. Let's further look at Oscar. Oscar later on gives us Estus Flasks, which finally allow your character to heal themselves with refillable vials. Once again, he endears himself to the players by being useful, and he tells you to leave before he goes hollow, as he doesn't want to hurt you. When we find him hollowing and attacking you later, he's once again endeared himself through his actions of helping you. But when you really think about it, Oscar is also the one who tells you about the undead journey, which within the lore is a trap created by Gwendolyn Frompter Gwyn to get an undead to unwittingly sacrifice themselves to link the flame. It's all a giant lie, but what makes you, the player, so susceptible to this is that it's one of the game's most likable characters who unwittingly tells you this lie and sets you on your journey. It's fascinating when you think about the psychology of it, and I think other games should look at this as an example of how to properly lie to players. Another game that did this really well was the original BioShock. It's similar in making you trust someone who keeps on doing things that would seem to help you when the character has their own ulterior motive. It's great writing, and whether From Software did it on purpose or not, which given other characters we find, I assume they did, I applaud them for this. So here we are at the Undead Asylum, and what happens to be the tutorial area of Dark Souls 1. I think this, along with Demon Souls, were the best tutorial areas of the Souls games, but before I get into that, I do have a criticism for it. Anyone who's played Dark Souls for an extensive amount of time, especially if you play Bloodborne, will know that the optimal way to play the game is usually in rolling to dodge enemy attacks. However, the tutorial heavily emphasizes playing the game's sword and board style. It definitely teaches you how to roll, but what I mean is this. You're pretty much immediately given your shield and told how to use it. After this, one of your first scenarios is being ambushed by a mob along with an archer. The best way to handle this situation is with your shield, so you block all of these attacks and then strike at your first opportunity. I do think that's great for teaching how to use the shield effectively, but I also feel like you're given the shield too early or don't have enough enemies to train with, and by that I mean even a single real enemy to train without a shield. Especially when you're light and before you're mid-rolling or fat-rolling. It's the perfect opportunity to present a situation where all you have is a sword, and the best way to avoid getting hit is through rolling. Outside of that, I think the Undead Asylum is by far the best tutorial in any of the Souls game, and here's why. Simply put, the Asylum Demon is the perfect first boss. When he first jumps down, it's shocking, especially if you've never played a Souls game, and terrifying. If you try attacking him, you'll probably die, and it quickly sets the mood for Dark Souls in multiple ways. For one, the game is going to be challenging, and for two, if you stop panicking and explore around the room, you'll find an escape and get away from the boss. You've now been rewarded for thinking about and properly assessing the environment, which is a huge deal in this game, which constantly pounds that into you. Be cautious, check the environment for clues, and utilize it properly. Not only that, but when we come to the boss better equipped, you're given a new mechanic, that being the drop attack. This takes out roughly half of the Asylum Demon's health, and also presents you with an optional easier boss fight. Now, fully equipped and with healing items, knowing the mechanics of the game, you should be able to take out the Asylum Demon after a few tries, if not your first. He is difficult for new players, but not overly difficult, and this drop attack is a great way for new players to feel like they have a real chance to defeat him. Not only that, but because of how intimidating and challenging the Asylum Demon was when we first met him, it's extremely rewarding when the player defeats him. Right from the get-go, the tutorial established what the game is about, overcoming challenging situations, and a great sense of reward for doing so. Demon Souls attempts this by having an intimidating boss, but allows you to lose, thereby potentially never gaining that sense of reward. Meanwhile, both Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne omit having a boss, which I think was a mistake on the part of Dark Souls 2, whereas Bloodborne I'm more forgiving as it has a totally different feel as a game. I think Dark Souls 3 actually handled this the worst with Udix Gunder. He's overly difficult for new players, and certain builds, such as the Thief build, are at a huge disadvantage against him. While he sets the tone for, these games are about overcoming challenge, I think it's at the point of potentially being too discouraging. finally, another great thing about the Asylum Demon and the tutorial area is it has a now well-known Easter egg that rewards observant players. The Asylum Demon can be seen at the top of the Undead Asylum if the player truly pays attention. Meanwhile, we find Oscar bashed in through the ceiling of the Undead Asylum, about to die. And if we piece this together, it was the Asylum Demon who did this to him. The story is there and you're rewarded for paying attention, but it's never thrown in your face. Anyways, I think that's all I have to say about the Undead Asylum. To be honest, this area is a little boring to me, but it does make for a great tutorial area. So let's hitch a ride with a crow and head into Firelink Shrine. Firelink Shrine. Thanks in part to the sound design of the game, which opts to almost never play music unless you're fighting a boss, this truly feels like a relaxing hub and safe spot. This element of sound design is actually something I'm a little torn on. On one hand, some of my favorite video game music comes from environmental music. For example, playing through From Software's first video game series, King's Field, there's constantly this creepy music that plays in the background, and it really helps set the mood of the game. Meanwhile, a game like Skyrim has peaceful tracks playing in the background, which helps make the game feel relaxing while you're exploring. Dark Souls instead opts to only have environmental sounds ringing throughout, with heavy music playing during bosses to indicate a heightened sense of danger, which I'll touch on more when I get to the Taurus demon. And while I sometimes do miss the music, it also makes it so every track is far more effective. Because Firelink Shrine is one of the only places in the game with music, it really does feel like something separate, important, and peaceful. Meanwhile, if you eventually find Ash Lake, the track that plays there immediately creates a sense of awe and importance, as nowhere else in the game does this. I think, to my point, it's an interesting design choice, and I think one Dark Souls pulls off effectively. Another great thing about Firelink Shrine is that there are multiple branches here, with the game not holding your hand or telling you where to go. It's refreshing for a game to trust its players to figure out where's too difficult for them. And while I'm sure there are some players who have frustratedly quit out of the game at this point, this is the type of choice that makes Dark Souls stand out to players who do end up enjoying it so much. From Firelink Shrine, you can head into the Catacombs, Undead Burg, or New Londo, which actually has even more branches, but let's first take a look at a new player's perspective. If you go into the graveyard, the skeletons are genuinely hard and will probably kill you immediately. One thing I hate in games is when they block off a path telling you, "You shouldn't go here yet." It's such an obvious marker and pulls away from immersion, but this tells a player all they need to know. If you died to the skeletons right away, you should probably be thinking, "I'm not ready for this yet," or at least try to avoid it and look at other areas. If you want to keep on attempting the graveyard, fair enough, man, but at least you're given the choice. Option number 2 is New Londo. To be honest, I didn't even notice the entrance to New Londo my first time playing the game until multiple trips back to Firelink Shrine, which I think is one good point to why it's for later in the game. It's harder to find. That said, everyone's different, so if you do end up here first, once again, there's a lot that will show you not to come here. For one, unless you know how to utilize a transient curse, you can't hurt the ghosts, and that definitely feels too advanced for a first section of the game. So again, you should figure out right away this isn't the first place to go. And finally, our third option is Undead Burg, which is really the section designed for a first-time player and the first area you should go to. But the great thing about all of this is that it drastically boosts the replayability of this game. When you know what you're doing, it's fun to jump into the Catacombs and see if you can defeat Pinwheel at a low level, or even pick up different equipment there. If you grab the Master Key, all of Undead Burg is entirely optional, and you can head into New Londo, or to Blighttown, or the Darkroot Garden. And this non-linear, interconnected world design is part of what makes Dark Souls so charming, and it's, unfortunately, the only game in the series that has as open of a design in this sense. At this point of the game, everything cleverly wraps back to Firelink Shrine, and as far away as you get, there's typically multiple ways to get back, but more on that later. So, all of that said, let's talk about Undead Burg. If I'm being honest, this is one of my least favorite areas of the game. Visually, it's just not as interesting as the other sections, with enemies also being kind of bland here compared to other sections of the game. And look, that's totally fair as it's the first area of the game, and the game should build to something more interesting, but I think my issue comes from everything that adds up within this section. To say some positives first, the level design is really well done. Undead Burg has a lot of clever side paths that feel like secrets when you find them, offer some extra goodies, and then smartly wrap you right back onto the main path. There are also areas that are teased to you where you'll see an item in the distance, wonder how to find it, and then if you search, can find a path that will make you feel rewarded when you do find it. There's also a clever shortcut / drop which seems impossible to do if you're new, but when you discover it is possible, that in itself is massively rewarding. But as far as the enemies are placed, this area has a decent amount of mobs, which can be incredibly intimidating for new players. There's a section you have to run past with fire bombs being tossed down at you, where you're basically forced to run into a mob scenario. Unless you know about the Black Knight shortcut, which has a Black Knight guarding the path, this is one of the harder areas to run through and avoid enemies, which is good and bad. On one hand, it forces the player to learn that running past enemies isn't an option, and force them to learn to be slow and methodical, and learn how to play the game. It teaches you to be observant and take your time. On the other hand, as players are still learning the mechanics of the game at this point, it can be incredibly frustrating if it feels like you aren't making any progress. And while you'll probably be returning to the bonfire to level up frequently, at least I know I was on my first playthrough, as this was my first Souls game, I think being stuck in an area that seems a little more bland, without much option of any other section of the game to try without a far steeper difficulty curve, could be problematic. And look, there's no way for me to really know, as looking at achievement rates in Dark Souls is always a steady drop-off, as it is with any game. It's my guess that this area may be highly discouraging to new players. Of course, I'm sure many of you in the comments will tell me about how easy this section was for you, but it's my opinion that this area, including Undead Parish, could be the most discouraging part of the game for someone new. But okay, let's talk about some more positives. If you get the Master Key, you can head down to Havel's Chamber and out into the Darkroot Basin. The Darkroot Basin is visually interesting, has the Hydra, which is horrifying but super cool, and if you explore, you can get the Grassroot Shield, which is a really good shield, at least in my opinion. And while this experience won't be the same for everyone, it was here that I realized part of what helped me get through the game and enjoy it. While it felt super punishing to die because Dark Souls gets rid of all of your currency, with the chance to pick it up again, I realized that I could explore areas and just say, fuck it, about my currency and just try to find useful items, which I would keep. Exploring in hard areas could actually be rewarding, and as long as you weren't thinking about leveling up, dying was actually beneficial. It's a different way to play compared to other action RPGs where you die and lose everything. Weirdly enough, it actually makes exploring potentially easier to do. So with that, let's talk about the death mechanics of the game. When both Demon Souls and Dark Souls came out, this was actually a pretty big talking point, and one of the reasons these games were considered so challenging. When you die, you lose all of your souls, which act as both your currency and your experience points. That's normal enough, but there's no true saving in Dark Souls. In most games, when you die, while that's punishing enough, you return to your save point with all the experience points and currency you had prior to saving. However, as Souls doesn't have this, you'll lose everything. The game does counteract this, though, in a couple ways. For one, you have the chance to collect all of your souls again, unless you die a second time, at which point they're all lost. For two, this currency is really the only thing you lose, and I think that's a really important point. Every item you collect while exploring, even if you die, you'll still keep. You also never lose levels from dying, at least in Dark Souls, so a dynamic is created. On one hand, exploring is encouraged because you can find new and incredibly useful items. On the other hand, you'll always have to pay attention to how much health you have, how many Estus flasks for healing, and how many souls you have. There's a risk/reward for exploring, and if you have a lot of souls, you may decide to just cash them in before you explore and not have to worry about it, or you can take the risk. Once you're used to it, I actually find this mechanic in a lot of ways less punishing than normal action RPGs where you lose everything when you die. And it's been incorporated into a lot of games since, so it definitely has inspired a lot of modern game design, despite the initial criticism it received. Okay, so Undead Burg is fully explored. You've gotten used to the basic mechanics of the game, so you think, and you come upon your first real boss. Oh look, it's a bigger, scarier enemy. But it's not too bad, right? Wait a sec. Oh my god! That thing is horrifying now! And this is really the power of Dark Souls sound design. By the combination of a bigger, badder enemy showing up and the music, the fight immediately feels far more daunting. Obviously, if you're new to the game, being trapped on a small bridge with this thing is going to be frightening anyways, but by not playing any music and suddenly blasting it when the boss appears, you've drastically heightened that sense of tension. So I don't have too much to say about the Taurus demon, outside of that I think it's a good second boss if that's the order you choose. It's big and intimidating like the Asylum demon, so you'll feel rewarded when you defeat it. It's a little quicker and more challenging though, with a bigger health pool. But if you're clever, you have the option to plunge attack it, which really hammers in how important it is to explore the environment. Archers who shoot down at you indicate there might be another area you can go to, and you're rewarded for exploring this by finding a way to significantly decrease the Taurus demon's health in an easy way. It calls back to what you learned from the first fight against the Asylum demon, but implements it in a more challenging fashion. So I think it's a perfectly implemented boss fight, when it works. Onwards and across to the Undead Parish, where we get one of my least favorite things in the game, the Hellkite Drake. On one hand, I do like how intimidating it is, and I think it was a fun design choice to have the Hellkite Drake show up almost immediately after the Taurus demon without a bonfire or any way to feel safe or as rewarded for what you just did. But I think this is one of the areas that fails to warn the player there's a trap and they will get injured. If you look at the ground, there are burn marks before you walk onto the bridge where the Hellkite Drake is, but there's really nothing to indicate to you that you should walk on it, then turn tail and run away from it. There are tells that are really well done in this game, but this particular one bothers me. Fortunately, if you have full health, when the Hellkite Drake breathes fire on you, it probably won't kill you, but I would have preferred if the Hellkite Drake cut across the bridge and lit fire directly in front of you, indicating, hey, this area is going to be problematic, with a better tell. Or alternatively, if the Hellkite Drake swooped up from under the bridge, shot fire directly at the bridge in front of you, with the fire coming towards you. That way, you could at least have a moment to react and possibly run back to safety before the Hellkite Drake then perches on the wall across from you. Even getting through the bridge feels kind of poorly handled at this point. You can go underneath to find a path where you're punished because you can't reach the bonfire, but at the very least, you can still progress without figuring out how to cross through the Hellkite Drake. So on the positive end, that option was handled well with you losing out on a bonfire, which is a major reward, in return for safety. To get the Hellkite Drake to react in a way that you can run past it to said bonfire and get your reward, you have to wait in one of the safe zones until the Hellkite Drake reacts, seemingly gets annoyed, and flies in to get you. I do like this reaction by the Hellkite Drake, but there's nothing inherent to tell you to just wait in the safe zone until the Hellkite Drake gets bored and comes to attack you. Running out onto the bridge resets the amount of time you have to wait, which makes it especially difficult to figure out what to do in order to cause this animation. Something notable in this area is the ladder you can kick down to reach your previous bonfire at Undead Burg. Not only is it a great checkpoint, but more importantly, it's clever. After feeling panicked that you beat a boss, you have a lot of souls, and debating if you should carry on or not, if you get through the first attack by the Hellkite Drake, you get what's essentially a double reward, a ladder that creates a shortcut back to your previous bonfire. It's so cleverly designed, where even if you feel like you're traveling away, you end up looping right back to this bonfire, and now you have easier access to the Undead Merchant or Firelink Shrine if need be, which leads nicely into my thoughts about the Undead Cathedral. The Undead Cathedral contains what I consider to be one of the most critical shortcuts in Dark Souls, and what's quite possibly a game-changing moment. After traveling even further along the path past the Hellkite Drake, and making it to the end of the Undead Cathedral, you'll find an elevator which leads directly back down to Firelink Shrine. This creates multiple moments. First, it shows you just how interconnected the world design of Dark Souls is. While Undead Burg has an interconnected level design, with various paths that cleverly loop back onto themselves, this is a major moment that should show just how well the entire world of Dark Souls does this. Secondly, it's incredibly rewarding. At this point in the game, you've traveled pretty far away from Firelink Shrine, which is essentially a hub, and the one place that feels like a peaceful respite from all the hell going on outside of it. You've defeated a boss and traveled even further to a point where a second boss is looming. But after all of that, you've unlocked a quick and easy way to travel back to Firelink Shrine. Another thing I haven't mentioned is kindling bonfires, which I think is a bit too obtuse and confusing. But point is, bonfires typically start with 5 Estus Flask recoveries for your character, which also acts as a limit for how far you'll want to explore, as once you're out, it's a good idea to head back to the bonfire, recover these, and try again. While you can level up a bonfire to allow for up to 20, by its obtuse nature, I have a feeling not all players will have figured this out by this point. But Firelink Shrine's bonfire starts with 10 Estus Flask recoveries. So for players who haven't quite figured out this mechanic, the bonfire is made even more rewarding to be able to return to. This leads me to talking about bonfire warping, and an important point I really wanted to touch on this video. With the release of Dark Souls Remastered, I've seen a number of complaints about changes that weren't made, one of them being about bonfire warping.
We're used to things like, I don't know, what's a good example? Maybe not having to play most of the game before you get the Lord Vessel to warp. Maybe a little bit of a fast travel option before then would have been okay.
Sorry, Jim, I do enjoy your videos, I just want to illustrate this point. The problem with bonfire warping, and why it was such a smart decision in Dark Souls 1 to not allow players to do this immediately, is it completely negates the interconnected world design of Dark Souls 1. You see, when you can warp at the start of the game from any bonfire to another bonfire, it lowers the tension of exploring. Part of what makes the game get more intense as you progress further into the game is that you're slowly exploring further and further away from the safety of Firelink Shrine. At the same time, because you can't warp, that's what makes the shortcut in the Undead Cathedral to Firelink Shrine feel so incredibly rewarding. If you could warp from any bonfire, this wouldn't matter, and there'd be no reason for this shortcut to exist. When you find the bonfire in the Undead Parish, which is next to the Undead Cathedral, you would be able to just warp back to Firelink Shrine from there, which, yes, is convenient, but again, completely negates any reason for this shortcut to exist. And at that point, the interconnected world design doesn't matter as much. Not only that, but the game is designed around the idea that you can't warp. If you decide to travel into the Catacombs before you have access to warping and the Lord Vessel, you'll find a fairly difficult path down to the bottom, based on your level and how good you are at the game. But again, playing off the notion that there's tension to exploring as you can't warp, once you hit the bottom of the Catacombs, you'll have to somehow make your way back up, which in many places can be even more difficult than traveling down. You've now put yourself in a predicament that you have to get out of, and that's something you'll always question anytime you pick up a new bonfire in Dark Souls during a first playthrough. How far away am I from Firelink Shrine? And how hard is it going to be to get back? It creates an entirely different feel of playing through the game than if you can just warp out, because at that point, none of it matters, because you can easily escape to safety. Even looking at Blighttown, the area was also designed with the idea that players will be looping out of it. Most first-time players will travel to Blighttown via the depths, and the escape out of Blighttown is its own challenge, again, purposefully designed that way. I mean, hell, the game even put Lautrec in Firelink Shrine, who will take out the bonfire once you reach Blighttown. Let's consider what happens when you can't warp. You have a tense trip traveling up the mills of Blighttown and passing through a cave of trolls. When you finally reach Firelink Shrine, the bonfire doesn't exist, and that's horrifying, as this is the safety hub you've been trying to reach. But suddenly, you remember that you created a shortcut to the Undead Parish, and because you're a smart player, you can safely travel to that, making the shortcut you opened way back at the beginning of the game even more important. None of this would exist if you could warp in Dark Souls right off the bat. It wouldn't matter. You finish Blighttown, and okay, just warp back to wherever you want to go next. It's a completely different game feel, and part of why it's my opinion that it was such a good decision to not allow for warping. So, what would happen if you could warp right off the bat? The answer is, the design of the game would have to change to accommodate for this idea, which is exactly what we see in Dark Souls 3, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 2. Both Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 allow for warping right off the bat. So, let's talk about both. In Dark Souls 2, you have Majula as the main hub, acting like Firelink Shrine, and then 4 branching paths that go in completely opposite directions and never connect. And while it's not as satisfying than as if the world connected, the truth is, you don't really need it to. The individual level design isn't as strong, which is more of what people notice. But again, the world connecting doesn't matter. You can travel to the far end of any branch and warp there whenever you want. There's no reason it needs to connect. In a lot of ways, it's really more similar to Demon's Souls in that regard. The world connecting to the hub is just a nice but unnecessary touch. Meanwhile, while Dark Souls 3 contains certain areas of the world that connect, for the most part, you have distinct paths that go in separate directions, then dead end, because again, making the world interconnect isn't as important. However, Dark Souls 3 does a better job of accommodating for this design choice within the level design, and the way they need to in order for it to work with warping bonfires. So let me show you what I mean. The Cathedral of the Deep contains a minor Firelink Shrine in some ways. You'll find one bonfire in the entire area, but next to it are two incredibly obvious locked shortcuts. So, in order to create more tension, you spend a certain amount of time traveling away from this bonfire, and then eventually the game wraps back to that singular bonfire opening one shortcut. You then use that shortcut to repeat the same process of looping around to open shortcut number 2. This is how the game functions in order to create a similar feeling. There's no reason to include a wrap back to the overall world or hub at any point, as you can just warp there. So they have to create this feeling in individual levels, which isn't as effective. But compared to Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3 is designed around this concept. Dark Souls 1 isn't. Simply adding warping completely negates the overall design of Dark Souls 1. Bloodborne is a little better in this regard, as while you can warp immediately in the game, you're forced to warp back to the HUD before you can then warp to another area. This is so inconvenient, especially with the loading times of Bloodborne, that it disincentivizes warping just enough to make Yharnam mostly connecting a rewarding touch. I know I've been harping on this for a while, but I really want to hammer in how important of a choice not allowing warping off the bat in Dark Souls 1 is, and how much it changes the game, as well as how much the game is designed around this concept. Similar to not having a mini-map or objective markers, this is one of those touches that makes Dark Souls unique and stand out. It's part of the reason many people enjoyed the game. And while you could argue warping is optional, you could say the same thing about a mini-map or objective markers. The point is, not being given the option to use these things are what creates tension and adds both challenge and reward to the game. If you know that you can just warp at any point, even if you choose not to, it completely destroys that feeling, as any predicament you get yourself into, such as getting stuck at the bottom of the Tomb of Giants, which happened to me, the easy option is there, and it's no longer a daunting prospect to get out. The shortcut to Firelink Shrine is nice, but it's no longer important. How much you hate Lautrec for killing the Firekeeper at Firelink Shrine doesn't matter, because you'd be able to warp to any bonfire regardless. While yes, it certainly is convenient to be able to warp at any point in Dark Souls 1, that's not what the game is about. The point of the game is to establish obstacles and challenges for the player to overcome, and then reward them for doing so, and not being able to warp ties directly into that. But alright, I'll stop harping on this point. Your first truly required boss, as Taurus Demon is actually skippable, are the Bell Gargoyles. This is another great boss fight that perfectly works off what the game is about. For players who haven't played Demon's Souls, the fact that a second Bell Gargoyle comes halfway through the fight is a daunting surprise. But while it adds another layer of challenge to the fight, you actually have a pretty large space to try and escape from, with this fight being a balance of patience and choosing when to be aggressive. The fight feels nicely balanced and is definitely something new players can overcome, which you want at this point in a game. Moving forward, you find the Darkroot Garden and Darkroot Basin, which is a nice change of scenery that should help add a new layer of intrigue to players. I also love the inclusion of the Hydra at this point in the game, because it further helps distinguish Dark Souls from other action games. Leading up to Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, most action games would actively encourage you and reward you for fighting crazy and horrifying enemies. So much so that nothing really ends up feeling daunting or intimidating. In God of War, Devil May Cry, or Bayonetta, which I acknowledge are completely different types of action games, if you see something like the Hydra, your instinct would be to run up and attack it. However, at this point in Dark Souls, your instinct should be the exact opposite. That giant monster in the distance could very easily kill you, and furthermore, the question of how you're going to get past that thing is a real question, and that's part of what I find so endearing about Dark Souls. You actually feel helpless at times, and unprepared for various situations, which makes overcoming them all that much more rewarding. Another thing I think is important about the Darkroot Basin, if you don't have the Master Key, this is where the game truly opens up. Even for new players with the Master Key, this is probably where you'll feel like you suddenly have options. You can head to the Moonlight Butterfly and take down that boss. You can try and take on the Hydra. You can go into the Valley of Drakes and thereby Blighttown. Or you can go fight the Bell Gargoyles or Capra Demon, depending on your progress at this point. You can even head into the Darkroot Garden, either by saving up for the Crest of Artorias or by going around it and find Cinder. This non-linear element works to the game's favor in a plethora of ways. For new players, it's nice to feel like you have options, especially if the game is overly challenging. If you're struggling too much with one area, you can tackle another, level up, better equip yourself, and return to an area you were struggling with later. Even if they're all challenging, at least you're open to choose which challenge you want to tackle. For returning players, this gives you several routes you can tackle and allows for completely different types of playthroughs. It's the same thing as what makes the Mega Man games so replayable. Part of the fun of those games is that you can pick the boss and level in any order you like, which was revolutionary for the time of the game's release, as it was the first game to do so. In this way, returning to play those games is always fun, as you're not stuck to a linear route. While not every game is necessarily serviced by this choice, with Octopath Traveler being a prime example I like to talk about at some point, when done well, it massively boosts how replayable a game is. Despite how much I love the forest, as it turns out, you're actually supposed to head back to the Hellkite Drake to get into Lower Undead Burg with a key you should have picked up around this point if you're paying attention and properly exploring. I do think this is a little obtuse to find. From my personal experience, I completely forgot about the door the key opens despite looking at the key's description, and I've also watched friends stream the game who also had no idea where to go at this point. I'm sure it's nitpicky and other people had no trouble finding it, but I think it's worth pointing out. Either way, for a game that's heavy on exploration, I don't think it's a big deal. Capra Demon is notable as it's the first boss with extra enemies in a boss arena. It's also by far the most aggressive boss so far, with the demon and dogs immediately running at you right when you enter the fog gate. Like most people I've seen talk about this, I'm not a fan of extra enemies in boss arenas. While I don't mind a boss who doubles up, like the Man-Eater or Bell Gargoyles, those feel properly balanced. This, on the other hand, is just kind of annoying and can feel unfair, especially with the dogs who are already pretty hard in the first place. On a positive note, I like what From Software was going for with a boss being super aggressive. It's a great way to keep players on their feet and change things up at a point where you might be starting to get comfortable. But I think a hyper-aggressive boss would have done the trick without resorting to the dog gimmick. With Capra finished, we reach the depths, and the Basilisks. The Basilisks who are capable of cursing you, which I would call by far the largest punishment in the game, as it reduces you to half health until you find a Purging Stone to take care of it. This is one of those punishments in the game I feel is a little too harsh. Both Dark Souls 2 and 3 backtracked on the effects of this with the Curse of Dark Souls 2 dropping your hollow level, and in Dark Souls 3 it just kills you with no lasting effect. I do like that the curse has a different kind of penalty than other effects, which makes it unique, and I actually think Dark Souls 3 and 2's penalties are too tame. That said, I think a penalty of 1/4 of your health gone after being cursed would have been much more manageable and still a decent penalty. You do die from getting cursed, and the lasting effect would still be harsh, but at least you feel like you could still carry on to a degree. With half of your health gone, it's truly crippling, and I think that's far too harsh this early on in the game. You do open up the female undead merchant just before this point who sells Purging Stones, but I'm not sure how many people will realize this, as you'll have no idea just how bad the curse status is until you get knocked down by it. So it's not something you'll be looking out for. Also, you could pretty easily think to go to the first undead merchant to find an item to cure your status, only to find he doesn't carry it, which would feel defeating. Outside of that, I don't have too much to say about the deaths other than the Gaping Dragon is an awesome boss. With the Gaping Dragon down, we enter Blighttown, an area that honestly gets a bad rep, partially because of the garbage frame rates at the bottom. Leading down to the bottom is a fun area of narrow bridges and platforms constructed together to make a maze-like path. But reaching the bottom of Blighttown, we get to what I truly dislike about the area, which is a poison swamp. There was an area like this in Demon Souls, and also similar in the future installments of the game. Looking at the game as a whole, and from the perspective of a large world, it's an interesting area and fits in nicely. But I've never been a fan of these poison locations. When it's a swamp, like in Dark Souls 1, it's something you're forced to trudge through slowly, which just makes it annoying more than anything else. While you can get the Rusted Iron Ring to counteract this, even being forced to switch it on is a hindrance. Being slowly poisoned isn't too challenging. Again, it's more of just kind of annoying. The design of Dark Souls is overwhelmingly set up to give players various challenges, with the point being a sense of reward and accomplishment for overcoming the set of challenges. For my part, these types of areas fail at that, as getting past them never feels rewarding outside of, thank God I'm done with that shit. The boss of the area, on the other hand, Quelaag, is a lot of fun, with a mix of attacks that change up what we've seen before, making for an interesting battle. Apparently she's overwhelmingly easy in co-op, but I like tackling these games solo, so it's not something I can comment on too strongly. With Quelaag's defeat, we both unleash a new NPC and open up Sen's Fortress. While I'd go into Frompt, he's really more important from a lore standpoint, and I've already covered that so heavily in other videos, I'd say go watch one of those if you'd like to see that. He does give you your next goal in the game, which, as our cutscene has indicated, is to travel to Sen's Fortress and into Anor Londo, the City of the Gods. Sen's Fortress really tests if you've been paying attention to what Dark Souls has been trying to teach you most of the game, which is to pay attention to your surroundings. It's also a nice nod to previous From Software games, in that we've actually seen similar trap-filled dungeons in the King's Field series, and in particular, King's Field 2's Passage of Death. While this area can be hell to go through, I absolutely love it for the challenges it presents. Almost every trap here is fair, and the game has already made it abundantly clear to you that you should take your time in new areas and not rush through. If you do so, you'll be able to notice the various switches and traps. The first trap we find is a switch that activates arrows that will shoot out at you. You're given plenty of time to avoid these, and even have lizardmen who will rush at you and possibly get in the way of the trap, getting injured themselves, giving you yet another means of learning the trap and understand what the area will be without it feeling unfair. Another trap in the area is an elevator that leads to spikes on the ceiling that will kill you. Unlike the Hellkite Drake bridge, this is far better indicated. For one, you're already in an area filled with traps, and you know that you need to pay attention to this stuff. Secondly, this elevator has blood all over it, indicating something's wrong. While you may not know exactly what, it's a good clue into it. In fact, the only trap in this area that I find to be unfair is the mimic chest. While I actually love these things and think they're fun, and overall when you know of their existence, do think they're fair, as they move around slightly and if you have a keen eye you can spot them, the first time we find one, there's really no indication that something will be wrong. Yes, you can spot it, but it's so subtle, I doubt most players would ever notice. You're also so used to chests acting in one way, I think you need a slightly better indicator that there's going to be something wrong for it to feel fair. Of course, the fact that the first chest is in Sen's Fortress is a great start, as that is the perfect placement for this chest. That said, I don't personally mind this gotcha moment, which is really what it feels like, but coming from the standpoint of how fair it feels, it doesn't match most of Dark Souls' design. Finishing Sen's Fortress, we reach Anor Londo. I think Anor Londo is a bit of a mixed bag. The area is giant and grandiose, which definitely gives it the impression of an important place and is fitting both for the lore and the build up to this point. However, the outer portion also feels kind of empty. Now, I do understand the lore perspective of this, and there's nothing wrong with breaking up the pacing with a wide open space like this, but it mainly sticks out when you're trying to traverse from one point to another after you already know the layout and have completed its various challenges. On a positive note, I love that getting into the chapel requires you to run across the top of a buttress. It almost feels unintentional, and while it definitely is, the act of finding it and realizing this will be a way to get to your next destination actually feels like you're sneaking into somewhere you're not supposed to go. The rafter segment that follows can be a bit of a pain, but it's not so bad that it feels unfair. I also love that by running through the rafters, not only does it cement the grandiose scale of the area, as this is where lords resided, but also feels like a new kind of challenge. However, we do find the Anor Londo Archery Club here, which is a bit ridiculous. When you know how to play the game, you'll know various ways to get through this challenge. If you're good at dodge rolling and parrying, it's really not all that bad. If you're not, holy hell, man. And I think this is one of the examples in the game of an area that goes too far towards unfair, especially as it decides to toss not one, but two archers at you. I think it's an interesting challenge, but my god, man, I wouldn't fault anyone for being pissed about this. While the outside is a little hit or miss, and I'm not just talking about the archers, I think the inside of Anor Londo really shines. Going through the cathedral is a bit of a maze, and the Silver Knights really help train players at parrying if it's not something they've worked on yet. Also, the fact you can skip half of this makes me happy, as these exploits are always fun and can make you feel clever. Of course, what's really one of the most interesting parts of the whole section is Ornstein and Smough, or perhaps the biggest test of the entire game. From a lore perspective, they're meant to test if an undead is worthy enough to see Guinevere, and you can bet your ass I'm gonna try to be that person. But it also ties in with the gameplay, as this boss fight is a culmination and true test of your skills. It'll ask you to properly manage fighting two enemies at once, and understand that sometimes being patient is a better strategy than trying to rush in, which is something the game has been teaching the entire time. Ornstein and Smough behave differently, with one being quick and agile, while the other is slow and powerful. They test two different skills, and they work perfectly in tandem. Killing one will make the other stronger, suddenly giving you a challenging one-on-one boss fight, yet again testing how well you can pick up on the enemy's tells and react. Interestingly, this also gives them more replayability, as if you come back on a New Game Plus run or a separate game, it's fun to test your skills against the boss you didn't fight the first time. It also gives new players a choice, so if you're struggling with one, you can choose the other. I think Ornstein and Smough's most challenging boss in vanilla Dark Souls, discounting the DLC of course, and this is the perfect placement for this battle. At this point, players should already be dedicated and have a strong understanding of the game. It's immensely rewarding to defeat the pair of them, and doing so opens up multiple previously locked off paths for you, which is a massive reward in its own right. At this point, you've reached the final portion of the game, and where the game has its biggest issues. You're presented with 4 paths you have to travel in order to get the various Lord Souls to finish the game. In theme with the game so far, the order in which you do this is completely up to you. However, structurally, this is where the game feels different and loses some of its charm. What I'm mainly referring to is the game loses its interconnectivity. Part of the charm of the game, up to this point, was discovering how parts of the world connected to each other, discovering new shortcuts, and discovering new paths. Now, the world of Dark Souls has grown to a grandiose size, with 3 distinct faraway branches, that being the Duke's Archives, the Tomb of Giants, and Izalith, with New Londo still being relatively in the middle of things. To make up for this, you're now given the ability to warp, which does add a level of convenience and a sense of accomplishment, as it's something you've unlocked, but also feels necessary. So I'm going to present an alternative concept that could potentially solve this issue. That said, it does have its own issues, which I'll also bring up. One way to solve this problem is within Anor Londo itself. If, say, when you reach Anor Londo, there's now 2 branching paths on top of the Duke's Archives, you can now create an entirely new area of interconnected paths and locations around the city itself. From a purely gameplay perspective, this could give players a continuing sense of discovery as they work their way around the city. Then, the Bonfire of the Princess's Chamber could warp back to Firelink Shrine or the Undead Parish, given Lautrec's involvement. Now, without warping, you can explore beyond the Princess's Chamber and feel even further from your hub of Firelink Shrine and what's essentially your home, creating a greater sense of danger as you stray further and further away, as you know that Princess's Chamber bonfire is the only way to get back to your hub. This now heightens the sense of danger at the final portion of the game, which the game has been ramping up to, and continues the design of Dark Souls you've known up to this point, but with an even greater sense of fear for being far from home. On the flip side, this concept does break the overall world design. It is interesting from a lore and world perspective to see these opposite ends of the world the various gods and lords of the world have made their homes. I'm not claiming my concept is better than what the solution from Software found was, especially as the overall world design and lore of the game, even if you don't know the lore, is part of what makes the game so interesting to play. My first time playing the game without knowing any lore, something about each area felt important, and like it truly mattered as it all fit into the world you were traversing, so that is an important aspect to keep in mind. It's really meant as food for thought, and a way to try to critically think about gameplay design, and how you can continue to build and heighten the initial design around the game. So let's talk about these branches. While I briefly mentioned the Catacombs before, this area leads directly into the Tomb of Giants and Nito. The Catacombs is actually one of my favorite areas of the game because it so strongly utilizes vertical game design. There are several branches for traveling down the Catacombs, and several shortcuts you can find as well if you're creative enough. And I think that was the fun for me. It wasn't carving my own path downwards. Another thing about it that I actually find to be great is that the path back up is, in some ways, more challenging than the path down. My first time going through the Catacombs was before I activated the Lord Vessel, and the realization that I had to make my way back up after trapping myself at the bottom was pretty significant. Of course, this all depends on when you choose to go into the Catacombs, but I like this as a possibility. If you're a new player, you actually get a really great reward in doing so. The Great Scythe, the best weapon in the game. Okay, I do love the Great Scythe, but really, you get the Rite of Kindling, which for any new player is a major find, as it'll allow you to upgrade your bonfires so you can get 20 Estus Flask uses instead of 10. However, returning players and skilled players can entirely avoid this until they need to traverse to the Catacombs later in the game, which just adds to the brilliance of the design. From Software was smart enough to reward players for taking the challenge early on. Pinwheel, on the other hand... Alright, here's the thing with Pinwheel. He's a joke of a boss because he's so easy when you need to traverse the Catacombs, but he's also designed so you can fight him early in the game. In some of my runs, I travel into the Catacombs first, just for the hell of it, and to get some quick souls, and he's actually pretty challenging. I do like his design, but he probably should have had more defense or health to make him at least slightly more challenging for when players will typically tackle him. The Tomb of Giants, on the other hand, I'm not so fond of. To his credit, it does mix things up, which I like. The challenge of not being able to see what's in front of you, unless you specifically hold up a light source instead of a way to defend yourself, that's a great dynamic to add in. I'm willing to say I might just be bad at fighting them, but I hate the skeleton dogs. There's also the issue of getting the large Divine Ember, which is stuck in a tomb with a ridiculous amount of aggressive giant skeletons. While I usually enjoy these types of traps, they should either be utilized for areas where there's nothing important, or have a better way to tackle and get out of the challenge. As it stands, unless you're a range build, going for the large Divine Ember is basically a suicide mission, which you can do as you'll still have it after you die, it's just not great design. The area's pathing does have some nice twists and turns to it if you follow it properly, at least during the front end, but overall it mostly feels like a straight line. I get that it might sound like a hypocritical critique, considering I just praised the Catacombs, but with the Catacombs, the area does have a lot of interesting design choices and twists to it if you follow the normal path down, whereas the shortcuts, which are the reward for exploring and taking risks, turn it into a straight path. The Tomb of Giants really is just a straight line if you turn on the lights, which leads me to my suggestion for the area. The gimmick itself is interesting and cool, but it's really the overall bathing that makes the area feel more flawed. I think if the area had been more of a maze, maybe even more so than any other area of the game, it would have heightened on the design choice of being unable to see in front of you. The area does do it for a little bit when you're going through the caverns, but it could have really built upon this idea. Nito as a boss is fine. I know some people hate the boss as he's pretty easy, minus skeletons who won't die unless you have the proper weapon equipped, making him a bit of a gimmick boss. For my part, I don't actually mind these gimmick-style bosses as long as they're done with restraint. So long as the overall gameplay is still in line with the rest of the game, I think it can help add a bit of variety. And for new players who aren't so skilled, it can actually be a bit of a relief in a way, which I'll talk about more when we get to the Witch of Izalith. I do, however, think there are some other ways Nito could have been made into a more interesting boss fight, but still include a gimmick. For my suggestion with Nito, as we see him rotting away branches during the intro, it could have been interesting if you fight him in an arena where he can rot away certain paths you're on, so you have to toggle handling him or the environment. Similarly, as he's the Lord of Death and seems to have some control over skeletons, the arena could have been built with various bones in the walls that he could summon to attack the player, making the arena hazardous, but still something a player could spot and react to if paying attention. Either way, these are just gimmicks I think would have been more interesting, as I haven't really seen them in a Souls game yet, period, and you'd still be fighting as you normally do, but with an environmental hazard. Needing a divine weapon to take out the skeleton guards is fine, as you've already had a chance to learn this as a thing through the Catacombs, but it's also the only time you ever need to change weapons for a boss fight, which sticks out. The next path we'll take is the Duke's Archives in Seath. We're presented a number of obstacles that makes this area unique. In the Duke's Archives, you're more or less required to die and taken to a prison where you're cut off from warping. I mean, look, there's a way around this utilizing the elevators, but I'm sure that's unintentional. Luckily, unlike Dark Souls 2's Shrine of Winter shortcut, it was at least never patched out. These glitches and unintentional shortcuts are, in my opinion, a part of the charm of games. They add another layer to exploration, so I'm actually pretty disappointed when this sort of thing is patched out. While it's a little disappointing you're required to die in the game, unless using the unintentional shortcut, I do think from an overall standpoint this was an interesting element, especially for first-time players, which too often gets forgotten when fans of Dark Souls discuss the design. After Anor Londo, and especially if the Duke's Archive is one of the later areas players choose to explore, this is the point when new players should start to be feeling more confident and powerful. Not only that, but you can warp around, which takes away some tension. So the game has to find different ways to continue to challenge the player, and rather than just upping the difficulty and health of enemies, which gets monotonous after a while, trapping you in a dungeon and taking away the ability to warp to safety is one such way to present a new challenge. And while I honestly find the area to overall be kinda tedious when replaying, I do think this was a good choice by From Software, and I'm glad they went through with this concept. It also brings up another thing I want to talk about before jumping into the Crystal Cave and Seath. While I complained about the linear branches in this latter portion of the game, it is worth noting a major challenge the developers had to face. When playing through the first portion, it's pretty clear there's a specific path that you're meant to play through. While you can go in any order you like, which I already praised enough earlier, the game is still able to properly ramp up the difficulty and various challenges the player faces due to the clear order you're intended to progress. After finishing Anor Londo, the player is suddenly given 4 branches they can tackle in any order they want, which presents a number of design questions with both pros and cons. Do you make the enemies in certain branches more challenging than others, so there's a clear order the player should tackle these? The pro of this is players will most likely play in this order and never get too OP, but that somewhat takes away the nonlinear factor of presenting 4 branches. So if you really want players to be able to go to any of these branches with no particular advantage to each, you have to make the enemies relatively similar in difficulty. However, in an RPG where you level up, like in Dark Souls, the branches will slowly grow easier and easier, with the final branch players choose being the easiest. This is leading up to the climax of the game, so this is pretty problematic unless the point of the game is a power fantasy, which Dark Souls isn't. So, Dark Souls' solution to this was the various gimmicks I've discussed so far. The Tomb of the Giants is dark, so the challenge is in the environment. The Duke's Archives locks you in a prison and away from warping, then as a Harry Potter staircase puzzle. Its final segment, the Crystal Cave, uses another environmental challenge with invisible paths. Izalith has you treading on lava, which drains your health, and New Londo New Londo uses narrow paths and ghosts whom you need transient curses to fight. The challenge of these areas aren't really the enemies, except for the skeleton dogs, fuck those, but really in the environment, and that was Dark Souls' solution to this issue. And while certain areas were more successful than others at attaining this, I do think it's an admirable solution and the correct one for this specific game. So back to the Crystal Cave. This is the second portion of the Duke's Archives, with the conceit being there's invisible paths you'll need prism stones or can use the snowflakes to spot. To be honest, I don't think this area was handled well. I do like the concept of it, as it's an interesting quandary, but the prism stones aren't good enough to be useful. Since you drop them right in front of you and the ledge to a path could be anywhere, they're totally unhelpful, and you need a giant number of them if you're actually going to try using them to find paths. The snowflakes are fine, but they're fairly slow, so you'll end up standing and waiting a bunch until you eventually memorize the paths. And I think the solution here is pretty simple, which is really what makes it a shame. If the prism stones had a glow to them and highlighted a larger area, suddenly they'd actually be useful. Additionally, the snowflakes could be more plentiful and fall a little faster, maybe even with a little more of a glow to them when they land on the path. That way, the path would be at least a little more obvious, and with that, more invisible paths could be added. As it stands, there's hardly any invisible paths, and thank God for that, as they're so annoying the first time playing the game. So I think a solution where the paths can be spotted at least more easily, but not fully given away to players, would have allowed for more invisible paths in this section, and potentially a more interesting area. As it stands now, it's really just a raceway to Seath, and becomes pretty forgettable once you know the linear path to get to him. As far as the Seath fight goes, I actually like this boss fight. He's different from other bosses we've seen before, and fighting him doesn't involve any strange gimmicks to make him more challenging. He's also a reference back to From Software's very first game series, King's Field, which is an absolutely amazing series of games, and I appreciate the reference. Seath also has a tail drop, the Moonlight Sword, which is yet another King's Field reference, as the Moonlight Sword is highly important to the King's Field series, and has become somewhat of a mascot to From Software, making a cameo in multiple games of theirs. So, good job. Sneaking in references like that without being overt about it is always a nice touch. Next up, let's head to New Londo and the Darkroot Garden. While New Londo can be confusing at first, as the enemies are ghosts you can't seem to hit, right at the start of the area you'll find some transient curses. And so long as you're paying attention to what things do, checking the description of them will reveal using them as how you can attack a ghost. So we have another interesting change of pace with how to approach an area, with this area letting you only attack enemies while a limited time buff is taking place. That or you're cursed with half of your health. I think that's another element of Dark Souls that makes it so strong I don't see people talking about too much though. The game could have settled with making enemies stronger and relying on its primary gameplay mechanics, but the game constantly tests you in different ways while still revolving around these mechanics, which is great overall design. It constantly says, okay, you can understand these mechanics and can perform them well enough, but what if you're on a narrow bridge? What if now you're surrounded? What if now you have to pay attention to a buff and can't use some of your other buffs? The overall design of New Londo is also really cool, with the eventual reveal that you've only been able to see half of it, and there's a full area underneath you. There's also major lore implications to all of this, which, well, I've talked about enough in my other videos. Another cool thing about this area is you can drain the water at the very beginning of the game, and if you manage to beat the 4 kings early on, you actually discover a major secret with huge lore implications and a new covenant, that being Koth. If you're playing the game straight and not murdering every NPC you come across, this is the point you'll be required to return to the Darkroot Garden to deal with Cinder. It's nice that, similar to New Londo, we're returning to an area we've probably explored before, and an area you can similarly conquer before you need to. Cinder himself stands out as another exemplary boss battle in Dark Souls, both because of how sad it is fighting him when he's injured, and even more so if he recognizes you due to the DLC, as well as because the battle is different than other fights in the game and stands out creatively, which is something Dark Souls 1, as well as Demon Souls and Bloodborne did so well. Many of the boss battles stand out as new experiences, and many feel completely different than the other fights in the series. Of course, Dark Souls does reuse the Asylum demon 3 times, but for the most part it does a great job, with Cinder being yet another prime example. New Londo's big bad, the 4 Kings, is another good example as well, as this fight tests not just how well you can do against the boss, but also how quickly you can defeat them, as the longer you take, the more kings you'll have to deal with at the same time. Finally, we come to the Demon's Runes and Izalith. The visual aesthetic of the area is fantastic, with it truly feeling like a civilization. The Demon's Runes seem like an ancient hellish land that feels lived in, with Izalith being based off of Angkor Wat, which works beautifully. Ceaseless Discharge is another unique and interesting boss, with him being a slow and heavy-hitting tank. The Centipede Demon also stands out as a different and unique boss, and I absolutely adore the fact that you can actually see the Centipede Demon clinging to the wall if you're observant prior to fighting it. The optional Izalith shortcut via the Chaos Covenant is a cool touch, and a nice way to reward players for joining and exploring the Covenant system. But that's sadly about where the pros of the area end, as I'm sure everyone is aware. The Demon's Runes are almost entirely filled with Taurus and Capra demons, with little variety. And while I don't personally mind the reappropriation of former bosses as normal enemies, especially in the way it adds to the overall lore of the game, I do think a little more variety would have helped, and I think adding just one more animal-based demon would have been enough. Either that, or at least reworking the design of the area a little bit. The top portion where the lava drains from could have been similar, but had more weaving lava puddles players could choose to either run through or try to avoid, and the Taurus and Capra demons place a little more interestingly within this maze of puddles, and that alone would have been an easy change without dramatically changing the area. I find the runes themselves aesthetically interesting, but they're short-lived, and it's a shame there isn't at least a little more travel through them. While the Asylum Demon and the Stray Demon work well in that they're both bosses found in the same area, with one being upon an optional revisit of the Undead Asylum, the Demon Fire Sage is stretching the reuse of the boss a little too far in my opinion. But while the Demon Runes could have used a little upgrade, Izalith is probably the most in need of sprucing up, which is unfortunate as the overall concept is an interesting one. You're forced to use up a ring slot in order to equip the orange charred ring and traverse over lava that's constantly draining your health while you're on it, but you can also find various branches where you're safe from this health drain. It's disappointing as this is a good concept, and all that really needed to be done was to play around with the layout of the elements in the bottom portion of Izalith, as well as enemy placement. Maybe add some narrow corridors you have to travel through where you can't easily avoid enemies, and it could have been a truly interesting area to traverse. As it stands, it's a simple run-through where you easily avoid the various dragon butt demons and stone dragons. The Chaos Eaters are completely underutilized, which I don't completely understand why. And the boss of the area, the Bed of Chaos. In general, it seems like people hate these types of objective bosses in the Souls series, with the Dragon God of Demon Souls being another example of a despised boss. For my part, I actually don't mind as it changes things up, and on my first playthrough of the game, it was actually kind of a relief, because I wasn't very good at the game back then. But before I get all of the hate, on subsequent playthroughs, Bed of Chaos has quickly become my least favorite boss, as it feels like it's partially luck and just praying I don't get pushed into a pit. The main reason I bring up that I didn't hate this boss at first is that I think that so long as it's only one boss, having an objective-based puzzle boss isn't inherently a bad thing. It just has to be done well and be fair. I think the real problem with the Bed of Chaos isn't the overall concept of the boss, is that it often feels unfair and it's so easy to get insta-killed, with certain builds also being at a heavier disadvantage. That's the true issue with the boss. Something I think is fairly well known at this point, thanks to people digging through Dark Souls files and finding cut content and animations, is the Bed of Chaos actually has other created animations, and Hidetaka Miyazaki has stated they tried to do something else with the Bed of Chaos for the boss fight, but ran out of time and were unsatisfied with how it came out. So, if you were unhappy with the Bed of Chaos, so was the From Software team, by the sounds of it. With all of the necessary Lord Souls, we can head into the Kiln of the First Flame and fight Gwyn. But before getting into that, let's talk a little bit about the hidden areas and bosses of Dark Souls. For me, one of the things that truly elevates Dark Souls into being one of my favorite games is how unflinchingly unafraid it is to have a multitude of major locations and bosses that are super easy to miss and genuinely rewarding to find. While many modern games will hold players' hands and guide them to every area, including ones considered secret, as companies don't want to waste time, money, and resources on locations players may never discover, these sorts of secrets make the overall experience more enjoyable even if you never find the secrets. The reason being that exploring actually means something. Ash Lake, which is aesthetically my favorite location of the game, is found behind not one, but two illusory walls. For actually trying to find these illusory walls, or being online and using the message system, players will find not just important and powerful items, but entire unique locations and set pieces. Similarly, properly exploring Firelink Shrine will reward players not just with additional items, but the ability to travel back to the Undead Asylum where there's an optional boss, a ring to help traverse over water, and access to yet another major hidden area, the Painted World of Ariamis, which includes yet another optional boss, major lore implications, and is an entirely unique and well thought out area of its own. Even players who pay attention to the lore and item descriptions will be rewarded, as a hidden item will reveal Guinevere as a fake. Players who take a leap of faith and attack her will discover a massive secret of Anor Londo revealed. And both through this and another hidden lore method, players can find yet another hidden optional boss, Gwendolyn, who has possibly the largest lore implications of anything, as he's essentially taken over as a shadow ruler of Anor Londo. It's these kinds of things that make the world feel lived in and a place worth exploring. While open world games often get knocked for being wide open, empty spaces, Dark Souls is crammed with items, lore, and unique handcrafted assets all throughout. You can feel the love and care that was put into every area and the uncompromising vision behind it. Another thing I want to talk briefly about before wrapping up is the DLC, which comes with the remastered edition. Ulasil fits in perfectly with the world of Dark Souls and also contains some of its best bosses, all of whom feel entirely unique, with Artorias being my favorite boss of the entire game and series. While big dudes in armor became a little overplayed in Dark Souls 2, what made Artorias so unique was that Dark Souls 1 rarely contained these kinds of bosses. He's also significant to the lore, and if players have been paying attention, a living legend that you're discovering and fighting against. It's similar to fighting the various lords after watching the intro cinematic. By the time you discover Artorias, if you've been paying attention to the game's lore, he should be super built up in your mind and a bit of a shock when you first discover that this is going to be a boss fight. The Sanctuary Guardian, Manus, and Calamite are also incredibly unique bosses, with none of them being like anything we've seen before in the game, and Manus being a worthy new final boss, as he's hyper-aggressive and definitely one of the hardest, if not the hardest, bosses in the game. Kelmeet also stands out as the first actual dragon you get to fight, so you'll get yet another taste of just how powerful the beings who were obliterating the dragons in the intro cutscene were. The Artorias of the Abyss DLC is the perfect addition to Dark Souls, and I'm glad new players discovering Dark Souls through the remastered games will get to experience it as part of the full package. So, with everything wrapped up, it's finally time to head into the Kiln of the First Flame and face off against Gwyn. I know many people find him too simple, especially if you know how to parry properly, with parrying being the easier method for defeating him. That said, maybe I'm just bad at fighting Gwyn in particular, or never had enough poise, but I find that he punishes you incredibly hard for screwing up a parry, and unless you know how to cheese him, by circling around while parrying, he changes up his moves often enough to still be more difficult to read, and his hyper-aggression and speed make it hard, at least for me, to always land a successful parry, and I frequently die due to this. If you're not parrying him, his speed makes him pretty formidable, with it hard to find a window of opportunity both to attack him and to heal. On a negative side to Gwyn, fighting him highly favors very specific playstyles, and whereas Dark Souls has been a game that allows for a wide variety of playstyles up until this point, it is disappointing for the final boss to not be as accommodating to this as the final test. On a positive note, Gwyn's theme that plays during the battle is a perfect representation of both him and the game as a whole. I love that as opposed to the heavy, dissonant songs that had previously played for many of the boss fights, Gwyn's is one that's tragic and sad, which stands out in a good way. I haven't talked too much about the multiplayer, as I tend to be more of a single-player gamer when it comes to these games, as I enjoy the experience and solitude of exploring these tragic worlds alone. So I can't comment too much on the ins and outs of how well or poorly the mechanics work in a PvP setting. I do think that Dark Souls is a great example of how to do an always online multiplayer game right, which is a carryover from Demon Souls. Invasions are an interesting mechanic that will keep players on their toes and can make already tense situations even more intense or possibly far more rewarding if players manage to defeat the invaders. Invading other players' worlds is also a fun mechanic, as it can be fun to both fuck with someone and to test your skills. Similarly, struggling players summoning other unknown players for help against difficult bosses is a great organic way to adjust the difficulty of the game, and it can feel super rewarding to help a random player out during a point where they're struggling. I love that the game works seamlessly, both if you're online or offline, and it doesn't affect if you're allowed to play the game. It's just an additional element if you're online, but the base game is still completely available and a full experience without it. The ghosts, bloodstains, and messaging system are a cool way to make players feel connected even while you're having a solo experience, and I'm fairly certain Demon Souls was one of the first games to have a multiplayer in this style. Both Demon Souls and Dark Souls utilize a multiplayer that doesn't feel like a separate mode, but is perfectly integrated into its core gameplay, and that's what makes it stand out. So, with that, I think that wraps up my major thoughts about Dark Souls and its overall design, at least the things I wanted to talk about. I realize that this video is similar in style to Matthew Matosis and other big YouTubers who do those big video essay style videos, but I thought it'd be fun to throw my own thoughts out there, especially since it's a game I love, and game design in general is something I'm super passionate about and I've been wanting to talk about. I hope this was an enjoyable listen, and while the editing of this video wasn't as high quality as a lot of my content, as I wrote this video to be listened to, with the visuals to help aid the audio, I hope you still enjoyed. A huge thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. Thank you, as always, for being patient in between my uploads, as I know it can take me a while to create and finish new videos. In particular this month, thank you to Aslish, Invidentia, Jason Buck, Ryan Drawn, Paul Copeland, and Fabian Garcia. If you enjoyed this video, I have a similar video on Mario Odyssey. Thanks for watching the entire video, and I'll see you next time. Peace.